The evening turned out to be foggy, with light rain, the drops of which softly tapped against the windows of the old cafe. The place was secluded, as if hidden from the world, and it was here that Alex and I decided to meet, to escape the monotony, even if just for a moment. I sat across from him, trying to hide what was bothering me. He didn't lift his eyes from his tablet, so absorbed in something that remained a mystery to me. However, I didn't ask. Perhaps I didn't even want to know. These were moments when silence was anything but comfortable. We just sat next to each other, like two people who had once known each other to the core, but now only faintly sensed each other's presence in their lives. John, Alex's old friend, sat across from me, making an effort to keep the conversation going, but I could feel that he, too, sensed the strange heaviness hanging in the air. He was just as polite and persistent in his attempts to cheer me up as always, but his smile seemed somewhat forced, just like mine. We were both probably waiting for the evening to end, so we could each return to our familiar worlds. This evening, originally intended for talking, had simply become an extension of what we had already been doing, each in our own world. I glanced at Alex. He sat in the same chair he always did, with the same calm expression on his face that I had once loved. His hands, unmoving, held the tablet, and his eyes, as always, were fixed on the screen. Sometimes he seemed as if he didn't notice me, didn't feel my presence. This strange feeling wasn't new, but at that moment it became especially vivid. With each passing year, we became more like strangers, remaining together by inertia, like two neighbors living under one roof, but not knowing what was happening behind the walls of their homes. I caught myself thinking that just a couple of years ago I would have eagerly discussed everything with him, the news, the book I had read, or something funny that had happened at work. But now, nothing came to mind. I tried to smile at John, keeping the conversation going, but inside something dark and impenetrable was churning. It was too easy that night to feel alone. On the table was a glass of water, and I suddenly felt the surface of the water begin to tremble, as if the world itself was faintly responding to my feelings. John was saying something, but I couldn't focus on his words. Somewhere in the distance, as if from another reality, I heard his voice, which seemed foreign to me despite its familiarity. We continued talking, but I was no longer sure that this was a real conversation. Everything around us seemed to be veiled in fog, and despite all my efforts, I couldn't dispel this feeling. When John suddenly addressed me, his voice sounded like a bell from another world, calling me back to reality. He said he was glad to see me, that I looked incredible, and added a few words about how I managed to maintain style despite all the worries. These words took me by surprise. I felt a bit embarrassed and, in an attempt to hide my confusion, responded with a joke. But inside me, something fluttered, as if I had once again felt like a woman, not just a part of someone's mundane life. He looked at me with interest, and in that gaze there was none of the usual polite friendliness, but something sincere that made me feel, for a moment, visible again. Perhaps it was a small thing, but at that moment it became something important to me. When Alex sat beside me, he rarely noticed me like this. His attention was absorbed by other things, work, his hobbies, anything that didn't concern him directly with me. And though I couldn't quite pinpoint what was wrong, I knew that this feeling of emptiness I was experiencing couldn't be normal. I caught a faint smile on John's lips and involuntarily felt a sense of lightness beginning to spread before my eyes. It wasn't tied to anything specific, didn't have a physical form, but it was somehow close by. I exhaled, feeling as if I had been briefly returned to this world. My response, though restrained, contained something more. Perhaps he noticed it, perhaps not. But it was in that moment that I began to feel the boundary between my thoughts and reality start to blur. I could no longer hide how this simple act of attention from John was restoring to me a forgotten sense of importance. Meanwhile, Alex continued to sit in silence, not reacting to what was happening. His eyes were still glued to the screen, and his fingers confidently slid over the tablet, engaged in something that had already become unimportant to me. At some point, I realized that this evening would no longer be what I had imagined it to be. That moment, when you feel how the world around you keeps spinning and you remain in place, as though you're looking at your life from behind glass. I looked at John again, and in his gaze I read something more than just friendly concern. He hadn't spoken it aloud, but there was a slight spark in his eyes that seemed familiar to me. It wasn't flirting, no, more like something deeper, a need to see, hear, feel something real. It was something I had been missing but hadn't dared to ask for, and now when he spoke again about how I managed to keep balance in my life, I felt an unknown gratitude wash over me for the attention I might not have deserved, but which had so unexpectedly, so delicately entered my life. I tried not to think about what had happened before, the empty conversations with Alex, how he didn't look at me, as if I were an insignificant detail in his life, but something in John's words made me pause. Maybe I am truly deserving of something. Maybe I deserve more than to be the one who quietly sits in the corner, waiting for the attention to return to me. When Alex finally tore himself away from his tablet and stood up to take a call, I felt a sense of relief. After all, this evening had been too tense, and his absence for a while gave me a chance to breathe. But with Alex's departure came emptiness. It wasn't just silence. It was the moment I realized how alone I was among people. John sat across from me. His attempts at conversation now seemed forced. He tried to keep the conversation going, but it was clear he understood that the exchange had become unnatural. I felt his words slipping past me, not lingering. We continued talking about small things, about what was going on in his life, about mine. But it all felt like some kind of performance where I couldn't play my part. It was as if I didn't know who I was anymore, and more than that, I didn't know what to do with the sudden, light anxiety that had settled in my chest. John looked at me in a special way, almost reproachfully, when he noticed I was silent, my gaze somewhere distant rather than with him. I couldn't hide what was bothering me, and it seemed he felt it too. "You deserve more attention than just being the person at the table when everyone else is busy with their own things," he said with a hint of sadness in his voice. I didn't know how to react to those words. They weren't an accusation, but I felt their weight. For some reason, they struck me deeply. I smiled and said something vague, trying to avoid a direct response. But his words wouldn't leave me. They kept echoing in my head, making me wonder if I truly deserved more than just existing beside someone who hadn't seen me in a long time. My gaze drifted again toward Alex. He was engaged in his phone conversation, and without even trying to listen to his words, I understood that at this moment he wouldn't notice me. In his world, I was no longer the center. I had become something on the periphery, something not needed for now, but not in the way either. It was painful. And then, this moment, when I sat in the cafe with John and Alex was somewhere in the distance, became the turning point. He had gone back to his work, leaving me with this strange feeling as though something irrevocably was falling apart. And I didn't know what to do with it. What was I supposed to feel? Perhaps it was just fatigue, or maybe a forewarning that something had cracked between us, but I couldn't call it betrayal, no. It was just silence, which had become our main companion. John looked at me again, as if trying to understand what was going on inside. I tried to regain control, smiling, but behind that smile, there was a void I couldn't hide. John's words kept haunting me, but they didn't bring relief. In fact, they deepened the uncertainty. When we stood up to leave, I felt a slight chill pass over my skin. I knew that this evening would leave behind not only memories, but also questions to which I couldn't find the answers. When we returned home, the same inexpressible discomfort hung in the air, just like it had in the cafe. Alex once again immersed himself in his tablet, and all I could hear was the quiet rustle of his fingers across the screen and the occasional, fragmented phrases he uttered into the phone. I tried not to think about what I was feeling, but every movement he made, every remark seemed to strengthen the invisible barrier between us. I sat in the corner, feeling more and more distant from his world. My attempts to start a conversation, Asking how his day had been, or talking about something light, met with walls of silence or half-finished sentences. I could feel my anxiety growing, as if in our home someone was always leaving something unsaid. I tried to focus on the book in my hands, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation with John, to the words he had said, and how they had made me see myself differently. Suddenly, just as I was about to go into another room, I received a message from John. His words were simple, but there was something in them that made my heart freeze. "It was great to see you again. You look even better than I remember." These lines, written without any ulterior motive, struck me like an electric shock. I nervously read them again, trying to understand what it was in them that made me feel not like I had been before this evening. My heart clenched. I couldn't explain why these words, empty, without intention, without any further actions, had caused such a reaction. But they stirred something within me that I hadn't noticed in a long time. I didn't know how to respond. What do you say to someone who suddenly reminds you that you can still be seen, alive, real? I wrote a brief reply, saying I was glad to have seen him too, but the strange sense of unease wouldn't leave me. My gaze dropped back to the phone screen, but instead of feeling relief, I realized I couldn't go back. I couldn't stop thinking about how these words had awakened a wound in my consciousness that I hadn't fully realized was there. Alex noticed that I was silent. He looked up and asked what was wrong, but I just shrugged and said everything was fine. I returned to my phone, trying not to think about what I had felt. I didn't know what to do with this moment, didn't know what to do with it at all. At that moment, it felt as though I was standing on the threshold of something that might change everything in my life, but I wasn't ready to face it. I wasn't ready to admit that something had changed, even though it was already so obvious. The next day, when Alex left for work, leaving me alone in the apartment, I felt a strange silence filling the space. It wasn't the cozy kind of silence that brings peace, but a heavy one, as if something hidden lurked within it, something that should have been uncovered long ago. I sat on the couch, trying to focus on something productive, but my thoughts kept drifting away. I kept returning to John's messages and the things he had said. Even if he hadn't meant anything special, those words, like sparks, ignited something long forgotten in my soul. At that moment, I heard the doorbell. I stood up, a little surprised since I wasn't expecting anyone. Standing on the doorstep was John. His face didn't reveal anything unusual, but I felt my heart tighten. He said he just wanted to stop by, have a coffee, and chat. I hesitated for a moment, but then, not knowing how else to spend the day, I invited him in. We sat in the kitchen, talking about work, about ordinary things, about what had changed over the years. Everything seemed like it always had. His kind face, his warm smile, the jokes he always told with a special touch. But with every word, I felt stranger. It seemed as though he was searching for something more in these conversations, something I couldn't grasp, but something I nonetheless felt. Then, suddenly, the conversation shifted to something more personal. John spoke about his past relationships, the pain he had gone through, and how often people tried to convince him to let go of the past. He spoke calmly, without emotion, but every word, every memory was soaked with bitterness that seemed to resonate with me. I couldn't understand why his words affected me so much. Maybe because they made me question what was keeping me in my marriage. Maybe because his pain somehow touched my own hidden pain, the one I had been trying to ignore for so long. He talked about regrets, about not always being honest with himself and others, about how life doesn't always unfold as you expect, and how you have to be able to let go in order to move forward. I listened to him, and all I could feel was that I, too, had reached this point where something was wrong. I didn't know what it was, but there was a feeling that I could no longer return to my old life. My hand involuntarily clenched into a fist, and I felt something stir inside me. We kept talking, but I couldn't listen the way I once had. Every look he gave, every word he spoke, became more and more meaningful, as though they were opening up something long forgotten within me. When he left, I was alone in the apartment, and that loneliness felt alien. I could no longer ignore the thoughts that had been accumulating in my mind. I realized that I could no longer live in this unnoticed swamp, not understanding what was happening inside me. And though I wasn't ready to admit it to myself, I knew that something was changing in this world, and I couldn't ignore it. John left, and I was alone again. But this time, that loneliness wasn't just emptiness. It was the realization that I was standing at the threshold of something new, though I didn't understand what exactly awaited me beyond that threshold. At work, I saw John again. He had come to discuss collaboration, to talk about new project ideas, but despite the professional context, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was no longer just a business conversation. We sat in the meeting room, discussing the details, but his gaze was constantly focused on me, and I couldn't escape that feeling. It was something more than just attention. It was as if he was reading me, and I couldn't understand where all that understanding was coming from, understanding that I didn't even dare to acknowledge within myself. Every word he spoke, every glance he cast, made me feel truly noticed. There was something special in his eyes, not just admiration, but something deeper, something that made me reflect. It was both unsettling and mesmerizing. I tried to focus on the project, on what we were discussing, but his presence in the room disrupted my usual train of thought. I kept catching myself thinking about it, even when I tried to ignore it. His questions became more personal, though he never crossed any boundaries, and that was the strangest part. It was as if he was trying to understand what lay behind my restraint, what caused my anxiety, what made me remain silent even when I didn't want to. I couldn't understand what it was, but it seemed like he knew the answers to questions I hadn't even asked myself. I tried to ignore these thoughts, diving deeper into the discussion of the project, but I still felt his attention focused on me, and it was impossible to overlook. I tried not to think about what was happening in my life, about how everything was changing, but his presence at that moment became the link I could no longer ignore. He wasn't judging me, he wasn't pressuring me, but it was clear he wasn't just interested in my ideas. It was as if he was trying to catch something in me. Sometimes his words felt too direct, too precisely aimed at the place I was afraid to see. He spoke about the importance of feeling confident, the importance of finding one's own strength in a world full of uncertainty, and in his words, I saw a reflection of the very things I had been trying not to think about for a long time. I tried to suppress that inner voice, but it kept sounding in my head, making me wonder what I really wanted. I wasn't ready to open this to myself, but the feeling that I was standing at the threshold of something new grew stronger. When the meeting ended, I stayed in the office for a long time, feeling how the tension lingered in the air. I tried to regain my usual calm, but inside, everything was far from simple. John left, but his presence in my life, his gaze, and his words stayed with me. I didn't know what to do with it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. At night, when Alex and I were sitting in our living room, the silence felt especially heavy. He was looking at me as though something in my behavior had caught his attention. I sat across from him, nervously fiddling with my wine glass, trying not to show that everything inside me was falling apart. I could feel his gaze, which had once been so familiar, now seeming to pierce right through me. He had noticed something, but I couldn't understand what. Every word he spoke sounded distant, and I couldn't respond truthfully without revealing everything. But I couldn't tell him the truth. I wasn't ready to admit anything, to him or to myself. "You've been acting strange lately," he said, his voice laced with suspicion. I could feel something tightening inside me. It was as though everything I had tried to hide had become transparent to him, and he was starting to suspect something. But what? I didn't know. I couldn't find the words to explain it all. I tried to justify myself, saying I was tired, that there was a lot of work. But that was just an excuse, and we both knew it. Alex, as always, was too absorbed in his own world to uncover what truly lay behind my words. He reached for his phone again. That moment was a signal for me, a familiar pattern. He sank back into his world, into his work, into his screen, and I was left here, beside him, but alone. I felt like I could no longer stay silent, but the words wouldn't come. It wasn't until he showed me a message from John that everything suddenly clicked into place. Don't you notice what he's writing to you? He can't not see how you look, how you're changing. These aren't just friendly messages, do you understand that? Alex said, his voice tinged with anger. He squeezed the phone as though it were the only thing he could hold on to deal with it. I felt my heart freeze. I could have tried to justify myself, say that it didn't matter, that we were just keeping an old friendship alive. But in his eyes, I saw that he didn't believe me. He could sense that something had changed between us, and he was right. He could see that something more than just words was happening between me and John.